Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. This is going to be a slightly different sort of episode. So I am due to give a talk at the Society for Educational Studies annual conference on Thursday, and I wanted to record my talk in such a way that I could listen back to it in the car as I'm driving on my way to Oxford where the conference is being held. And then I thought, well, why not record it as a podcast episode, because my listeners might also be interested in hearing the talk. So here we are. So I'm going to jump straight in. I'll start by reading the title. Rewards and Justice, Addressing the Dilemma Inherent in the neo-Aristotelian Model of Moral Development. Good morning. My name is James Brown. I am a maths teacher at a comprehensive school in Coventry and an MA student at the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues, University of Birmingham. Today, I would like to discuss a dilemma that I believe lurks within the Jubilee Centre's neo-Aristotelian model of moral development. I will also suggest a solution to the dilemma. But first, what do I mean by dilemma? A dilemma might be defined formally, that is, without commitment to any particular substantive moral theory, as a situation in which someone must choose between two or more equally unwelcome courses of action. But what does it mean to say that a course of action is unwelcome? The answer will vary from one moral theory to another. According to virtue ethics in particular, a course of action would be unwelcome if it impeded flourishing, where flourishing is constituted by the ongoing realization of virtues, most specifically moral virtues such as courage, justice, honesty, kindness, etc. So we might define a dilemma in virtue ethical terms as a situation in which someone must choose between two or more courses of action which equally impede flourishing. Now, a distinguishing feature of virtue ethics is its emphasis on development, specifically the development of character, a process which involves the internalization of virtues. So, we arrive at my final definition of dilemma, a virtue ethical, developmentally focused definition, namely, a situation in which someone must choose between two or more courses of action which equally stall or reverse the internalization of virtues. But I have left something important unspecified. What does it mean for a virtue to be internalized? I would like to propose an answer. Virtues have components: perception, emotion, desire, behaviour, style, and, most importantly for our purposes, motivation. Motivation is that which energises and gives direction to behaviour. Some behaviours are performed for their own sake, in which case the motivation is said to be intrinsic. Other behaviours are performed for some separable consequence, a reward for example, in which case the motivation is said to be extrinsic. I propose that a virtue is internalised as the motivation for its associated behaviours shifts from extrinsic to intrinsic. For example, if initially a child is kind only on the promise of a reward, but in time comes to be kind for the sake of kindness alone, then this shift in motivation from extrinsic to intrinsic would comprise an internalisation of compassion. And intrinsic motivation is indeed essential for virtue. Aristotle himself said that an act is truly virtuous only if it is chosen for its own sake. That is, if it is intrinsically motivated. This idea is echoed in many prominent models of character education, including the Jubilee Centre's neo-Aristotelian model of moral development. The neo-Aristotelian model of moral development describes two pathways to virtue. The upper trajectory is for children who were raised with positive moral habits and who are therefore guided primarily by intrinsic or autonomous motivation. However, there is also a lower trajectory for children who weren't lucky enough to be raised with positive moral habits and for whom extrinsic motivators therefore play a greater role. The lower trajectory presumes what I like to call the lure hypothesis, where rewards are used to lure children into behaving virtuously in the hope that the behaviour might eventually become its own reward, after which we presumably begin weaning children off rewards or hope that they forget all about them. The same sort of intuition underpins reward programs at many schools, especially primary schools. At present, however, the lure hypothesis is only speculative. There is no empirical evidence to support it. I hope to begin addressing this lacuna as part of my MA dissertation this year. In any case, extrinsic reward programs are ubiquitous in schools and they aren't going anywhere anytime soon, so we might as well learn to live with them. Less open to debate is what would happen if both upper and lower trajectory children were in the same group or class. In a 2016 study on motivational spillovers, Gubler and colleagues implemented an attendance award at an industrial laundry plant. While the award had positive, albeit short-lived effects on employees who previously had poor attendance, it was found to undermine the intrinsic motivation of employees who previously had excellent attendance. So, the dilemma that was hidden in the neo-Aristotelian model of moral development is now beginning to bubble to the surface. The dilemma is this: should lower trajectory children be rewarded for virtuous behaviour or not? If so, this could undermine the intrinsic motivation of upper trajectory children. If not, this could stall their own progress along the lower trajectory. Thus, we have a dilemma in which one child's moral development seems to come at the expense of another child's moral development. I have experienced the effects of this dilemma firsthand in my practice as a classroom teacher, specifically a Year 9 tutor. An award programme, Feel Good Friday, was introduced to recognise, celebrate and promote good behaviour across the year group. Staff could nominate students who were then entered into a prize draw for a dessert party. Each Friday, the names of nominated students, along with the reasons for their nominations, would be displayed during tutor period. After a few weeks, however, a pattern began to emerge. Staff were disproportionately nominating lower trajectory students, and often for only non-bad rather than overtly good behaviour. This pattern began to breed resentment among upper trajectory students. Some would complain that the programme was unfair. Some began to show increased concern with being nominated for Feel Good Friday and with other extrinsic motivators. This problem, that one child's development could come at the cost of another's, is widely acknowledged in other domains, especially the academic domain. One way in which many schools try to address the problem is by having sets, that is, different classes for different academic abilities. Back in the moral domain, however, this solution would certainly be a non-starter. Because, though it may be obvious at the extremes, for many children it would be difficult, if not impossible, to determine whether they were lower trajectory or upper trajectory. One child may even occupy different trajectories with respect to different virtues. Upper trajectory for honesty, say, but lower trajectory for kindness. And even if they were identified and segregated, there is still no guarantee that upper trajectory children would not find out about extrinsic reward programs in lower trajectory classes or schools. and thus suffer the same demotivating effects. There are two other non-starter solutions that are worth quickly dismissing. First, why not do away with rewards altogether, and instead use strategies that can help build intrinsic motivation, such as positive relationships, role modelling, and high expectations? Well, because not all children are receptive to such strategies. Indeed, it is for the sake of these children's moral development that the lower trajectory exists in the first place. Finally, why not simply abandon flourishing as the goal of education? I feel like this would be like trying to win a game of chess by kicking over the table. I do not want to kick over the table. I would like to keep flourishing as the aim of education. For more on this, I would direct you to Chris Jansen's 2019 book, Flourishing as the Aim of Education. So, these solutions are certainly non-starters, but there is yet hope. Recall the Feel Good Friday programme and how upper trajectory children would complain that it was unfair. I think that this complaint might hold the key to resolving the dilemma. So, let's take a closer look at fairness or justice. So, what is the relationship between motivation and justice? Returning to Gubler and colleagues' study in the industrial laundry plant, they suggest that intrinsic motivation could be undermined by perceptions of unfairness. Within educational settings, there is little direct research on this relationship. I could find only two studies, Choriazad 2002 and Kazemi 2016. But both studies did agree that student motivation is positively correlated with perceptions of justice. And I think that we have now arrived at the source of the dilemma. Staff and students seem to have different perceptions of justice. Students tend to see things in terms of brute equality, where everyone should be treated exactly the same. Staff, on the other hand, seem to have a more equitable view. In particular, staff seem implicitly to endorse John Rawls's difference principle, whereby inequalities in the distribution of goods, rewards, for example, can be just as long as they are to the benefit of the least advantaged, in this case, lower trajectory students. In other words, sometimes fairness or justice demands that people are treated differently. It seems, then, that staff and students have different perceptions of justice. But what none of the aforementioned studies acknowledge is that perceptions are not fixed. Indeed, our perceptions are determined by our concepts, and our concepts change over time. Within the framework of character education, justice is a virtue, and virtues are educable. So, if a certain conception of justice is having negative effects, it makes sense to try educating a different conception. All this points to a novel hypothesis, namely, that instilling a Rawlsian conception of justice in intrinsically motivated children could reduce their susceptibility to the undermining effects of extrinsic reward programs, specifically those aimed primarily at lower trajectory children. This hypothesis has shown some initial promise. When a student complains about the fairness of the Feel Good Friday program, I now challenge their conception of fairness. Conversations usually go something like this. That's not fair. What do you mean? Why should they, a lower trajectory student, be rewarded when we aren't? So you think that everyone should be treated the same? Yes. Imagine that you were in charge of sharing some food between two people. How much would you give each of them? Half each. Now imagine that one person has just enjoyed an all-you-can-eat buffet, while the other person hasn't eaten in a week. Would you change your answer? Yes, I would give more food to the second person. Okay, so sometimes it is fair to treat people differently, according to their need. Yes, but that's different. How? And so on. Some of the students with whom I have had this sort of conversation have stopped complaining about the Feel Good Friday programme. Some have shown less concern with being nominated for the programme and with other extrinsic rewards. This is a promising start. If the hypothesis is to be properly evaluated, however, then it must be subject to randomised controlled trial. But it is now easy to see what shape such an evaluation might take. One could introduce an attendance award at a school and randomly assign students to one of two groups: an intervention group, in which students have conversations about justice, or a control group, in which students have conversations about something unrelated. Students' intrinsic motivation could be measured before and after the intervention via the usual measures, and then compared across conditions. This is something that I hope to do at PhD level. For now, let us consider an implication. Namely, for teacher training. If my hypothesis is correct, and instilling a Rawlsian conception of justice in intrinsically motivated children could indeed protect them from the undermining effects of extrinsic reward programs, then this suggests that teachers need to be prepared to engage students in conversations about justice. The script that I read a moment ago was an example of Socratic dialogue. Socratic dialogue naturally makes use of the Socratic method, which Socrates describes as midwifery, because it is used to help him deliver knowledge from his followers. Socrates, via questioning, would drive his interlocutors into self-contradiction, thus freeing them of their false preconceptions. In the script, the false preconception was the idea that justice consists in brute equality. The critical question was, essentially, would you divide food equally between a full person and a starving person? So, if my proposed solution to the dilemma is correct, then it might help to familiarise pre-service teachers with the tenets of Socratic dialogue. Time for a summary. I have argued that the Jubilee Centre's neo-Aristotelian model of moral development presents teachers with this dilemma. Should lower trajectory children be rewarded for virtuous behaviour, or not? If so, this could undermine the intrinsic motivation of upper trajectory children. If not, this could stall their own progress along the lower trajectory. But I have also suggested that the dilemma might be resolved by engaging upper trajectory children in conversations about justice, which could have the effect of safeguarding their motivation against the undermining effects of extrinsic reward programs. That's it from me. Thank you for listening. I will now take any questions. Okay, that's it. That was my talk. That's the talk that I will be delivering at the Society for Educational Studies annual conference in the next few days. Hopefully it was of some interest. If you have any questions or thoughts or feedback, please let me know. And before I go, my usual Patreon plea. This episode took an hour or so to produce. That's less than average. Episodes usually take a couple of hours to produce, and I aim to produce a couple of episodes a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, £2 to £3 once a month, then please consider signing up on Patreon and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution would be greatly appreciated. And if you do sign up on Patreon, you will gain exclusive early access to unedited videos of my recording sessions. So if that takes your interest, then again, please do consider signing up. As always, the link is in the show notes. And we will talk again soon. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you and talk again soon.